Hey guys, tonight we begin with something far more unsettling than golden crowns or glittering pyramids. Imagine sitting at a royal banquet where every bite could be your last, and where the wine is just as likely to burn your throat as it is to quench your thirst. This isn't luxury, it's survival dressed in linen and gold, and you're the unlucky soul chosen to test it all first. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy these dives into history. And tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe put on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1325 BCE. The good news, you've been elevated to a position of honour inside the palace. The bad news, that honour is basically being Pharaoh's chew toy for poison. You sit cross-legged on a reed mat polished smooth by centuries of servants. The air is thick with incense, frankincense, myrrh, and the underlying funk of sweaty harp players who haven't discovered deodorant yet. In front of you lies a feast: roasted goose, bread still warm from clay ovens, dates dripping with syrup, and honey cakes stacked like tiny pyramids. At first glance, it looks divine. But then you notice the bread, hard, gritty, and dusted with so much sand from the grinding stones that each bite feels like gnawing on a sandstone obelisk. Egyptian bread was infamous for this. Day after day, chewing it literally sanded people's teeth down to raw nubs. By age 30, you'd have the dental health of a modern demolition site. And here's the kicker, you don't even get to complain. You have to eat first in full view of Pharaoh and his nobles to prove the food isn't poisoned. One wrong swallow, and your promotion ends with you foaming on the floor while the musicians just keep plucking their harps. Poison was a constant threat in royal courts. Sweet wine and honey cakes were the perfect vehicles for slipping in crushed minerals or toxic herbs, because the sugar masked the taste, and your job, your entire existence, is to take the hit before Pharaoh does. The irony? Half the food might kill you without poison anyway. Meat was preserved in desert heat, meaning that your goose or fish often had a head start on rotting before it even reached the table. Stews simmered for hours in clay pots, hiding parasites under the perfume of spices, and wine, the supposed nectar of the gods, was strained through cloth that didn't always catch the beetles floating inside. Imagine being forced to drink chunky Cabernet with extra scarab protein. But this wasn't just dining, it was ritual. Egyptians believed that certain foods carried magical power. Garlic and onions were sacred, eaten for protection, even when they stank like a curse in the summer heat. Beer was offered to gods, to workers, to everyone. A thick porridge-like brew so cloudy it looked like something scraped out of a swamp. And because Pharaoh's meals were wrapped in layers of superstition, none of it could be questioned. You ate, you swallowed, and you prayed the gods were paying attention. Meanwhile, your body tells the real story. Your teeth ache from the sand, your stomach churns with meat that might not be entirely fresh, and your nerves fray with every glance at Pharaoh's suspicious eyes. You're not his trusted companion. You're a disposable filter, a human shield against the paranoia of court life. And as you raise the cup of honey wine to your lips, gritty with residue from the Nile jars, the hall goes quiet. You take a sip, smile weakly, and wait. Seconds stretch into an eternity while everyone stares at you, not out of admiration, but to see whether you'll slump over in convulsions or manage to survive dessert. Welcome to your life as Pharaoh's food taster. A life where every meal is an execution rehearsal, and survival depends on your stomach lining holding out just a little longer. And if you think this banquet is unsettling, wait until you find out what went on after the eating was done, where ritual, hygiene, and royal paranoia mixed into something far worse than spoiled goose. You sit in silence as the honey cake dissolves on your tongue, your jaw grinding against the grit like a pestle in a mortar, and for a moment you wonder if your teeth will give out before the poison does. The musicians never stop playing. The clapping of tambourines echoes off the polished limestone walls, and the painted eyes of gods stare down from the murals as if watching to see if you will collapse. Around you, The palace is alive with the smell of roasting meats, perfume, and oil lamps burning animal fat, a fragrance that clings to your skin and makes the air heavy with smoke. The banquet is no casual meal. It is theatre, politics, and paranoia, all stuffed onto a table that stretches longer than most villages are wide. Egyptian feasts were not designed for comfort. They were designed to overwhelm. Guests reclined on mats or sat cross-legged while servers brought endless trays of bread, stews, and roasted fowl. Wine was poured from amphorae sealed with clay, each jar stamped with the name of the vineyard and the year, because even 3,000 years ago people liked to brag about vintages. The irony was that much of the wine had spoiled during transport, so what you were really drinking was sour, vinegary, and sometimes floating with insects that drowned in the barrel. But no one admitted this because wine was a status symbol, so people pretended to savour the taste while swallowing beetle eggs like it was normal. As food taster, you quickly learn that the illusion of abundance hides a core of filth. The bread served at Pharaoh's table came from flour ground between sandstone slabs, which meant it carried a steady supply of quartz dust and grit. Archaeologists have found Egyptian skulls with jaws worn down to stumps, the teeth ground flat and infected from years of chewing on bread that doubled as sandpaper. By your 30s, if poison has not ended you, tooth abscesses will, and that is before you consider the meat. Goose and beef were roasted with garlic and coriander, but refrigeration did not exist, so preservation meant salting or drying in the desert sun. The heat kept the food from moulding, but it also meant half-spoiled flesh was passed around on golden platters, the aroma mussed with heavy spices. What your tongue calls flavour, your stomach knows as an approaching disaster. Food was also deeply tied to religion. You were not just eating calories, you were ingesting symbols. Fish was forbidden to some priests because it was associated with impurity, yet it showed up at banquets in great heaps. Lotus flowers floated in wine cups to honour the gods of rebirth, though the petals soon turned slimy in the drink. Garlic and onions were considered protective, eaten raw by workers and nobles alike, their stench so powerful that Greek visitors later complained Egypt reeked like a communal kitchen. Honey was sacred, offered to deities and smeared on everything from cakes to roasted gazelle. It was also the perfect carrier for poisons because its sweetness disguised bitterness, and this was why your role existed at all. Every time you swallowed honey, you had to wonder whether it was divine or deadly. Your job makes you notice things no one else dares to. The servants watch you with the same intensity as Pharaoh does. They know that if you fall over, the line of blame snakes back through the kitchen, and cooks risk execution for negligence or treachery. Poison was feared but rarely caught in the act. Records mention suspicions of rival queens or ambitious priests, but the truth is most deaths went unexplained. Food tasters became the thin line between survival and chaos. You are a human experiment repeated 3 times a day, and each time you survive, Pharaoh raises his cup with satisfaction, never thanking you, never acknowledging that your stomach is the battlefield where his enemies lose their chance. It is not just the poison that threatens you, it is the sheer volume of food. Banquets were tests of excess. Entire tables groaned under platters of bread, cakes, cucumbers, pomegranates, figs, and roasted birds, some stuffed with smaller birds for good measure. Archaeologists have found tomb paintings of feasts that show food piled so high it becomes absurd, as if an entire marketplace was dumped onto a single mat. To taste everything, even in small bites, is to overload your body daily. Indigestion was not a risk, it was a certainty, and many nobles relied on emetics or purges to keep enjoying themselves. You do not have that luxury. You cannot excuse yourself to vomit discreetly. Your performance is continuous, each swallow a reassurance to the watching eyes that Pharaoh will not die tonight. The paranoia seeps into your bones. You begin to taste suspicion in every bite. Is the bitterness in the stew from fenugreek or something more sinister? Is the numbness on your tongue from too much salt or the creeping grip of a toxin? You learn the flavours of every region, every farm, every vineyard, so that anything unusual makes you freeze mid-bite. Yet your caution is useless, because most ancient poisons had no taste at all. Crushed minerals like arsenic, powders of toxic plants, and extracts from snake venom could slip past even the most paranoid tongue. Your only defence is luck, and luck in Egypt is as fickle as the Nile's flooding. As you sit with the bread grinding your molars into sparks, the hall grows louder. Dancers clap their hands, servants bring in roasted cattle heads, and cups overflow with cloudy beer thick as porridge. Beer was the daily drink for rich and poor alike, brewed with dates for sweetness, but it was unfiltered, chunky, and full of floating grains. Imagine drinking a smoothie that tastes faintly of sweat and swamp. This was considered refreshing, and you must drink it to prove it is safe. Your stomach is now a cauldron of rotting goose, sandy bread, and swamp beer, and still the feast continues. The weight of ritual is everywhere. Eating was not just pleasure, it was performance. Pharaoh's survival was linked to cosmic order, and every mouthful affirmed his divine right. Your role, humiliating as it feels, is woven into that ritual. You're both expendable and essential. Without you, Pharaoh cannot eat in peace. With you, every banquet becomes a spectacle of endurance, with your body as the unspoken sacrifice. You are the invisible shield propping up the illusion of eternal rule, and as the incense thickens and the lamps sputter, you feel your body sway, not from poison, but from exhaustion. The feast can last all night, with music pounding, dancers twirling, and food arriving in endless waves. Your jaw aches, your stomach twists, and your eyes blur from smoke, yet you cannot stop. Pharaoh has not stopped, and until he retires, you remain seated at the edge of danger, pretending that you are more than just the first casualty waiting to happen. This is your reality. To live inside luxury and taste nothing but fear. To swallow splendour and digest suspicion. To know that each bite is both survival and sentence. And if this was the cost of staying alive during the meal, what happened after was far worse. When the palace emptied and the rituals of preservation began, rituals that turned food and bodies alike into offerings meant to last for eternity, the banquet finally dissolves into silence, the harps go quiet, and the last cups of beer are drained until only cloudy dregs remain at the bottom of jars. Your body is heavy with exhaustion, but the Egyptians do not see this as the end of a meal. To them, eating was only one side of a ritual that extended into eternity. What you have just swallowed does not stay in your stomach. It becomes part of Pharaoh's eternal existence, and every crumb and sip carries cosmic weight. The same foods that almost poisoned you tonight are the same foods packed into tombs, transformed into offerings, and preserved alongside the dead as if eternity itself required a catering service. The Egyptians treated food the way modern people treat insurance policies, always preparing for the day when they would no longer be alive to enjoy it. Tombs were filled with loaves of bread, jars of beer, hunks of dried meat, onions, figs, and even geese trussed and wrapped like mummies. Archaeologists have uncovered entire storerooms buried beneath the sand, each jar sealed with clay stoppers to last thousands of years. Some still carry the faint smell of fermented wine, though opening them now is less like stepping into paradise and more like sniffing a vinegar-soaked nightmare. For the ancient Egyptians, this was not absurd. It was practical. A pharaoh could not rule in the afterlife if his cupboards were empty. You begin to understand that your role as food taster does not end when Pharaoh puts down his cup. Every item you test at the banquet has a twin prepared for burial. Bakers were ordered to produce thousands of loaves shaped like birds or cattle, offerings that would feed the dead long after their bodies were wrapped in linen. The sheer scale of this was staggering. In some tombs, inscriptions list menus for eternity: beef, fowl, bread, beer, vegetables, fruit, and cakes, all replicated by priests through ritual. Imagine believing not only that you need lunch today, but that you'll also need the same lunch for all of time, every single day forever. That was the Egyptian logic. This obsession extended into the embalming process. Preserving bodies and preserving food were parallel arts. Both involved drying, salting, and sealing against decay. Natron, the mineral salt used to desiccate corpses, was also used to preserve fish and meat. What you rub onto a goose to stop it from spoiling was also rubbed into a king's flesh to prepare him for eternity. The smell of natron was everywhere, acrid and sharp, clinging to your nose whether you were in a kitchen or a workshop of embalmers. To an Egyptian, preservation was sacred work, whether you were saving a slice of beef or a pharaoh's heart. The absurdity lies in how much they believed eternity required abundance. Pharaohs were buried with entire kitchens carved into the walls, painted scenes of servants kneading dough or pouring wine, a symbolic guarantee that the afterlife would never run out of supplies. Wooden models of butchers and brewers were placed in tombs as insurance policies, tiny figurines frozen forever in the act of preparing a meal. To modern eyes, these resemble toys, but to Egyptians they were cosmic staff members, trapped in endless service to make sure Pharaoh never faced an empty stomach. You taste the food at feasts to guard his life, but you also represent the eternal struggle to keep him fed in the afterlife. There is a grim humour in knowing that while modern banquets leave behind dirty dishes, Egyptian banquets left behind thousands of years of archaeology. Burnt bread, animal bones and wine jars litter ancient sites, proof that what was consumed in life was just as important as what was carried into death. Even the jars of beer found in tombs show evidence of fermentation continuing after burial, meaning that somewhere in the Valley of the Kings a pharaoh's eternal meal kept bubbling long after the mourners left. Eternity smelled faintly of stale beer. Your body aches as you consider the weight of it all. You're not just protecting Pharaoh's body with your stomach, you're protecting his legacy with every bite. If you die, Pharaoh starves. If you survive, Pharaoh thrives. The paranoia you endure at banquets is mirrored in the paranoia of eternity, where food must never be absent or spoiled. It is no wonder that food and death became inseparable in this world, for the Egyptians believed that to eat was to live and to preserve food was to preserve the soul. The strange part is that while Pharaoh dined on geese and honey cakes, the workers who built his tomb were also fed, but their meals were entirely different. Archaeological evidence shows that labourers were supplied with loaves of barley bread, onions, garlic and beer so thick it resembled porridge. Their bones reveal arthritis from carrying stone and tooth decay from the endless grit in their diet. Yet even they were considered part of the cosmic feast. The bread in their hands was the same bread offered to gods, proof that in Egypt food was never only food. It was survival, symbol and sacrifice all at once. The incense burns lower and the lamps flicker, and you imagine your body lying in one of those painted tombs, wrapped in linen and surrounded by bread that tastes like sand and wine that smells like vinegar. You realise that as Pharaoh's food taster, your role does not end with your death. Your likeness would be carved onto the walls, forever depicted holding trays of offerings, frozen in the act of serving. You would feed Pharaoh in eternity as you fed him in life. There is no escape. Your stomach is not only his shield, it is his future, his eternity, his unbroken supply chain between this world and the next. And while the banquet fades into memory and your jaw still aches from chewing sand, the palace never sleeps. Rituals continue into dawn, servants prepare new offerings, and somewhere, deep in the temple kitchens, bread is already being baked for the next feast. The cycle never ends, because eternity never ends, and you remain trapped in it, tasting survival day after day, while knowing you are already written into the story of death. The torches sputter as morning light creeps into the hall, and you understand that this was never just about one meal or one banquet. This was about eternity itself, where food, fear, and the afterlife are bound together like linen around a corpse. And if embalming food for eternity seems disturbing, it is only the beginning, because what they fed the living in the palace baths and kitchens was far stranger. where hygiene, luxury and parasites clashed in ways that could make even poisoned honey cakes look merciful. The palace kitchens are already awake before the first rooster stirs. Fires crackle in clay hearths, the air is thick with wood smoke and the smell of onions, and servants shuffle barefoot through spilled grain that crunches underfoot like gravel. You wander through this haze, your stomach already heavy from the night before, and realise that nothing in this place screams luxury except the gold trays that will eventually carry the food out. Behind the curtain of opulence, the kitchens are closer to smoke-filled caves where sweat, soot and ash flavour every meal before you even touch it. The sheer scale is overwhelming. To feed Pharaoh, his court, priests, dancers, guards and endless guests requires dozens of bakers, butchers, brewers and cooks working like a human machine. The bread alone consumes staggering amounts of barley and emmer wheat, ground on sandstone querns by women whose hands blister and whose arms ache from hours of pushing stone against stone. Every loaf emerges with the same problem, packed with tiny fragments of quartz that wear down teeth. Archaeologists have found bread loaves inside tombs that still contain visible grit after thousands of years, proof that Egyptian cuisine came with a free dental plan of agony. You chew, you bleed, and you keep eating, because there is no alternative. Meat is prepared nearby in conditions that today would make a health inspector faint. Cattle, geese, and fish are hauled into the kitchens, hacked apart on wooden blocks, and salted or roasted over open flames. The Nile offered plenty of fish, but parasites lurked in the water, clinging to flesh and waiting to infest whoever ate undercooked portions. Studies of Egyptian mummies have revealed evidence of tapeworms, schistosomiasis, and liver flukes, parasites that thrived in the warm river waters. What you thought was a delicacy could easily leave you doubled over for weeks, your intestines turned into a thriving worm metropolis. Yet fish still appeared on the table because abundance mattered more than safety. Water itself was unreliable. The Nile was both life and danger, flooding predictably each year but also carrying silt, animal waste and human waste downstream. People drank beer more than water because the brewing process killed some bacteria, though not all. Egyptian beer was cloudy, thick, and more of a gruel than a drink, flavoured with dates for sweetness. Imagine sipping on a chunky smoothie that doubled as hydration and calories, then imagine doing that every single day. Beer was safer than the river, but it was also an unavoidable source of bloating, indigestion and flatulence that filled banquet halls with less than divine aromas. The kitchens also had their own ecosystem of pests. Grain attracted beetles, bread baskets drew ants, and meat hung from hooks swarmed with flies. Without refrigeration, cooks used smoke and spices to disguise the rot, but the insects remained. Excavations in Amarna have uncovered charred bread still riddled with weevil holes, and jars filled with grain husks chewed by beetles. This was daily reality, not accident. When you took a bite of bread, you were not only eating wheat and sand, you were enjoying the extra crunch of insects baked in. Protein, yes, but not the kind anyone advertised. And then there is the matter of oils. Food was drenched in fat from cattle or in sesame oil when available, stored in clay jars that often went rancid under the desert sun. Spoiled oil smelled like a mix of wet goat and sour milk, but it was still used, because waste was unthinkable. Imagine your salad dressing expiring in the heat, and someone deciding it was still fine as long as you added garlic. This was the kitchen logic. Cover the stench with something stronger and hope your stomach does not notice. What makes it worse is that kitchens were not just places of food preparation. They were sacred zones tied to ritual. Bread and beer were offerings to the gods, prepared with the same seriousness as sacrifices. Priests oversaw brewing and baking, making sure that divine order was maintained through daily food production. If a batch of bread went wrong, it was not just waste, it was a cosmic disruption. So bread came to the table regardless of grit, beetles or mould, because failing to present it was more dangerous than serving it inedible. You swallow not just for Pharaoh's survival, but for the universe's balance, as if Ra himself will notice if you skip a bite. The smell of the kitchens is unforgettable. Smoke hangs low, garlic perfumes the air, and sweat mixes with incense from nearby temples. Everything is sticky, oily, and humid, and your linen clings to your skin as you stand among steaming pots and roasting spits. Servants cough from the smoke, wiping their eyes with hands blackened from ash, and still the food must go out gleaming on gold plates as if it were the essence of purity. The illusion is dazzling, the reality is grime. Your stomach twists as you imagine how many unseen parasites slip through this ritual of abundance. Mummies studied by modern scientists reveal gallstones, clogged arteries, and evidence of chronic infections. Pharaohs ate the richest foods, but those foods likely shortened their lives with heart disease, diabetes, and parasites. You, the food taster, act as their shield, but you suffer the same damage. It is not poison that will claim you most nights. It is spoiled meat, sandy bread, or worm-riddled fish. Death is not quick, it is slow, one banquet at a time, grinding down your body as surely as the stones grind down the wheat. Even the walls remind you of this endless cycle. Murals in kitchens show servants carrying baskets of bread and jars of beer, painted in cheerful colours, immortalising the work that destroyed their teeth and spines. To the Egyptians, this was noble service. To you, it is a daily reminder that your stomach is a testing ground, and your body the final proof of whether abundance equals survival. As dawn seeps into the palace halls, you breathe in the stench of smoke and sweat and realise that in this place, food is never clean, water is never pure, and safety is an illusion as fragile as a clay jar. You live in a system where survival is painted gold, but underneath it smells of rancid oil and crawling insects. And if the kitchens are this perilous, the real terror lies in what Pharaoh demanded for medicine. Because when the banquets ended and the food rotted, the cures they believed in were even more hazardous than the poisons you feared at the table. The feast is over, the lamps are dim, and yet your stomach still churns as if a swarm of beetles has taken up residence in your intestines. In the palace, this is not the end of the night, but the beginning of another ritual. One designed not for pleasure, but for survival. Pharaoh does not rely on fate alone. He relies on remedies, antidotes, and medicines that are as likely to poison as to cure. You, of course, are expected to taste them first. Egyptian medicine was a strange mixture of brilliance and superstition. On one hand, they could diagnose broken bones, perform surgeries, and even use honey as an antibacterial dressing on wounds. On the other hand, they also prescribed crocodile dung, crushed beetles, and mould scraped off old bread as cures for everything from stomach cramps to divine curses. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts in history, contains more than 800 prescriptions, many of them involving ingredients that belong more in a compost heap than a pharmacy. For Pharaoh, these remedies were not optional. They were divine tools meant to restore balance between the body and the gods. For you, they were an additional hazard, because every cure had to pass your lips before it reached his. Consider the problem of poison. Egyptians feared it so much that they developed complex recipes for antidotes. Some included ground stones like malachite and hematite, which not only tasted like licking a riverbed, but also filled your body with copper and iron dust. Others relied on mixtures of herbs and animal parts, such as the gallbladder of a cat or the liver of a fish, mashed into pastes that were dissolved in wine. The idea was that by ingesting something disgusting, the body would reject the poison. In practice, your stomach rejected everything, and you spent hours doubled over, wishing the poison had simply finished the job. The irony is that some of their cures actually had scientific merit. Willow bark, used for pain relief, contains salicin, a chemical similar to aspirin. Garlic was prescribed for infections, and honey really did work against bacteria. But these bright spots were surrounded by a swamp of absurdity. Lizard blood, pig's teeth, and mouldy bread mixed with milk were all considered medicine. For Pharaoh, Such concoctions were meant to demonstrate the reach of divine power. For you, they meant choking down a slurry of foul liquids under the watchful gaze of priests who insisted this was sacred science. The taste alone was punishment. Imagine sipping a warm mixture of sour beer, donkey milk and ground up copper filings. It scraped down your throat like swallowing gravel and left your tongue coated in bitterness. Yet you could not grimace. Pharaoh was watching, and to show disgust at a remedy was to question the gods themselves. Your role was not only to survive the meal, but also to survive the medicine that followed, no matter how revolting. Worse still were the enemas, administered with reeds and designed to purge poisons or bad spirits from the body. Egyptians believed the bowels were the seat of illness, so purging them was considered vital. For Pharaoh, this meant privacy and attendance. For you, it meant ingesting the same herbal mixtures in liquid form long before he did. If the drink did not kill you, the cramps that followed left you staggering. Priests proudly recorded these remedies as triumphs, while your body turned into a battlefield of nausea and exhaustion. The palace stored these medicines in jars, each labelled with hieroglyphs that promised healing. Some jars held resins like frankincense or myrrh, imported from far-off lands, their scents sharp and almost pleasant. Others held animal fat, rancid and greasy, used as a base for salves. The worst held dried excrement, crumbled into powders and mixed with honey. It was believed that what disgusted you could also drive away evil spirits. You tasted this too, spoonful after spoonful, knowing full well that the only spirit being driven away was your own. Archaeological evidence shows that these practices left marks. Mummies reveal arteries hardened by years of fatty foods, teeth destroyed by grit, and gallbladders filled with stones. Yet papyri boast of cures that worked, listing prayers and recipes side by side, as if divine words could transform crocodile dung into a miracle drug. This was medicine as theatre, just as feasts were dining as theatre. Pharaoh did not just eat or drink, he enacted cosmic balance through every mouthful. You were part of the stage crew, swallowing the absurdities first to keep the illusion intact. The fear of poison only heightened this. In a world where enemies might slip ground minerals into wine, Pharaoh's physicians prescribed antidotes daily. Some involved drinking small amounts of known toxins to build tolerance, a practice echoed centuries later by rulers in other lands. To be Pharaoh's taster was to live in a permanent experiment, your body constantly fed potential poisons in the name of safety. You were less a servant than a laboratory animal dressed in linen. The humour, if it can be called that, comes in the contradiction. The Egyptians built monuments that touched the sky, wrote literature that lasted millennia, and mapped the heavens with mathematical precision. Yet their cures often boiled down to feeding Pharaoh mixtures of grease, dung and stale beer. For you, there was no choice. To refuse was to betray, to grimace was to insult the gods, and to die was simply proof that the medicine had been flawed. You were expendable in every sense, swallowed by a system that measured success by Pharaoh's survival, never your own. As the dawn brightens, the walls painted with scenes of eternal order, you clutch your stomach and wonder whether the gods themselves enjoy watching you suffer. The priests nod with satisfaction, convinced that balance has been restored. Pharaoh reclines, confident in his immortality, and you, the taster, stagger away, carrying inside you a toxic soup of poisons and their supposed cures, a living reminder that survival in Egypt was as much about ritual as it was about reality. And while medicine may have promised healing, the truth was that hygiene itself betrayed you at every turn, because the very baths and perfumes that kept Pharaoh fragrant were swarming with dangers invisible to the eye. The remedies have barely settled in your stomach before attendants arrive with perfumes, oils, and jars of scented unguents. Pharaoh does not simply eat, he is wrapped in a cocoon of cleanliness that to outsiders looks divine, but to you reveals another battlefield of hidden dangers. Hygiene in Egypt was a ritual as much as a necessity. The Nile's mud and heat made daily washing important, yet the very substances used to purify often carried their own hazards. Bathing was performed with water hauled from the river and scented with natron or herbs. Natron, the same salt that dried corpses for mummification, was also rubbed onto the skin as soap. It scoured dirt away, but it also burned and cracked flesh after repeated use. Servants massaged Pharaoh with oils pressed from castor beans or sesame, leaving his body gleaming, while you knew that rancid oil could harbour bacteria and spread infections. Archaeological analysis of mummies shows skin conditions, lesions and rashes that tell the story of luxury turned corrosive. Cleanliness was never simple. It was a negotiation between beauty and decay. Perfumes were prized above all. Incense of frankincense, myrrh and képhi filled the halls, while thick cones of scented fat were placed on heads to melt slowly in the heat, dripping down hair and shoulders. The site is often painted in tomb murals, elegant figures with cones crowning their wigs, but the smell in reality was closer to burning wax mixed with sweat. Imagine walking through a banquet hall while grease trickles down your back under the desert sun. This was considered refinement, proof that one lived above the stench of ordinary life. For you, sitting in the midst of this melting perfume, it meant choking on smoke and oil as your body absorbed toxins one whiff at a time. Wigs themselves were a symbol of hygiene, crafted from human hair or plant fibres, glued together with beeswax and resin. To wear one was to appear civilized, to be free of lice. In reality, wigs itched, grew hot, and sometimes carried their own infestations. Archaeologists have found lice combs buried in tombs, proof that no matter how many times you shaved your head or perfumed your wig, parasites still marched back in. To be clean in Egypt was to wage endless war against creatures so small they outlasted kings. Your position as food taster places you close enough to Pharaoh to smell every ritual, every oil, every trace of incense. The palace air is never fresh. It is saturated with smoke from lamps, the tang of natron, and the heavy sweetness of perfumes designed to impress the gods. This chemical fog clings to your lungs until your chest feels tight. The irony is that while the Egyptians valued purity, their very pursuit of it filled their world with fumes that harmed them. It was cleanliness as theatre, purity as suffocation. The kitchens contribute their own assault. Meat and bread mingle with perfumes and incense until the palace smells like a bizarre blend of roasting goose, sweat, and myrrh. Studies of residues on ancient jars confirm that oils often went rancid, perfumes soured, and fat lamps smoked constantly. Modern science shows that inhaling these fumes in unventilated rooms would damage lungs and eyes, yet the Egyptians believed this smoke carried prayers upward to the gods. You sit in this haze, tasting spoiled wine and breathing incense, your body serving as both filter and sacrifice. Parasites thrived in spite of all these efforts. Flies swarmed constantly, drawn by meat, waste, and sweat. Tomb paintings show servants swatting them away with fans, proof that even divine rituals could not silence the buzzing. Mummies reveal intestinal parasites that no amount of perfume or bathing could erase. Pharaohs themselves carried evidence of worms and flukes in their bodies, meaning that the most powerful men in the Nile Valley were not immune to the creatures that thrived in its waters. To taste Pharaoh's food was to invite the same invaders, to carry inside you the same crawling testimony of Nile life. There is dark comedy in this relentless pursuit of beauty and cleanliness. Oils and perfumes were meant to display immortality, yet their rancid smell betrayed decay. Wigs were meant to hide lice, yet they often contained them. Baths were meant to purify, yet the water itself carried disease. In chasing eternal fragrance, the Egyptians coated themselves in substances that preserved their corpses better than their lives. The very resins that embalmed mummies were the same smeared onto Pharaoh's body each day. You watch as attendants rub him with what is essentially embalming fluid, presented as lotion. He shines like a statue, but you cannot ignore the irony. The living man is already half a mummy, The atmosphere is suffocating and your body aches from constant exposure. Your stomach is filled with poisons and antidotes, your lungs with incense smoke, your skin with sweat that no perfume can cover. Yet the rituals continue. Every jar is opened, every oil applied, every cone of perfume set to melt. It is eternal repetition, hygiene a ceremony, survival a spectacle. And you remain in the centre of it, a witness and participant, your body eroded slowly by substances meant to promise purity. As night fades and the sun rises again, the palace gleams with the illusion of cleanliness, while its halls remain thick with odours and crawling pests. Pharaoh reclines in glory, perfumed, oiled, and gleaming, while you fight the urge to gag on the fumes. To be his taster is not only to eat his food, but to inhale his world, to swallow every layer of ritual that coats the palace in false purity. And if the perfumes and oils were dangerous, the clothing and tableware carried their own risks, because the dyes that coloured linen and the metals that shaped cups introduced poisons you could never taste until it was already too late. The palace hall glitters in the early light, linen curtains swaying gently and cups of gold catching the sun like tiny mirrors. At first glance, it is elegance perfected, a vision of civilization so advanced it seems untouchable by decay. Yet you know better by now. You have seen how abundance hides rot, how perfume hides sweat, and how medicine hides poison. What surrounds Pharaoh at this moment is no different. Even the linen on his body and the cups on his table carry their own quiet dangers. Clothing in Egypt was a mark of refinement, with Pharaoh's linen robes woven so finely that the thread seemed lighter than air. Yet the process of bleaching and dyeing was far from harmless. To make cloth shine white, workers soaked it in natron and sometimes in urine, which acted as an ancient cleaning agent. Imagine slipping into a robe that smells faintly of ammonia and scorched salt. This was considered the height of fashion. Bright dyes required even stranger methods. Red could be made with iron oxide, yellow with saffron or ochre, and green with malachite ground into powder. Some of these minerals contained arsenic or copper compounds that irritated the skin and could build up in the body over time. Pharaoh appeared draped in divine colours, but the very fabric against his skin was leaching toxins inch by inch. Cosmetics were just as treacherous. Pharaoh's eyes were rimmed with kohl, that famous black line stretching across eyelids like the wings of a hawk. It was made from galena, a form of lead sulfide, and malachite ground into powder. Applied daily, it protected the eyes from glare and may even have offered some antibacterial benefit. But it also introduced lead into the bloodstream. Studies of mummies confirm elevated lead levels, evidence that beauty doubled as slow poisoning. When Pharaoh touched his cup or rubbed his eyes during a meal, the same lead that decorated him made its way onto the food you were forced to taste. What looked like divine style was, in fact, heavy metal exposure dressed as glamour. Tableware shimmered with wealth, gold and silver goblets, alabaster bowls and copper platters piled high with food. Gold itself was relatively safe, but copper and bronze carried their own hazards. Acidic wine or beer could react with the metal, releasing compounds that upset the stomach. Drinking from these vessels was not always luxurious. Sometimes it was like sipping from a cauldron of metal shavings. You, the taster, discovered this first, your tongue tingling from the metallic bite. Pharaoh raised his cup only after you survived the swallow, blissfully unaware that his divine banquet was served in chemistry experiments. Even storage jars could betray you. Beer and wine were kept in clay amphorae sealed with resin or beeswax. Over time, resins grew rancid and beeswax fermented, creating odd flavours and potentially toxic residues. Archaeologists have found jars with visible crusts still clinging to their rims, proof that preservation often slipped into contamination. To the Egyptians, these residues were part of the natural order. To you, they were just one more invisible risk poured into your cup each day. Wigs and ornaments added another layer. Pharaoh's elaborate headdresses and jewellery were inlaid with lead-based glazes and coloured stones polished with copper. The sweat of the body slowly leached these materials, which then found their way into food by touch. You could almost taste the minerals every time you lifted a piece of bread or licked wine from your lips. It was impossible to separate the banquet from the adornments that surrounded it. You were always swallowing fragments of the palace itself, as if the walls, fabrics and ornaments were slowly dissolving into your body. The absurdity comes from the contrast. To outsiders, Pharaoh gleamed like a god, his eyes lined with kohl, his robes glowing, his table set with precious metals. To you, seated beside him with food in your mouth, it was like watching someone dress themselves in poison while smiling proudly. Archaeologists today marvel at the brilliance of Egyptian artisanship, the intricate beadwork, the shimmering jewellery, the polished vessels. What they rarely mention is that the beauty was corrosive. The elegance that dazzled was also corrosive to skin, eyes and stomachs. There is also the issue of parasites carried by cloth and hides. Linen was considered purer than wool, but fleas and lice still nested in it. Combs found in tombs carry evidence of these infestations, tiny eggs fossilised in the teeth of the combs. Every time Pharaoh adjusted his robe, every time you brushed crumbs from your lap, you carried the risk of another bite, another itch, another wave of pests that no perfume could disguise. Hygiene rituals helped, but they never eradicated the problem. To wear clothing in Egypt was to invite microscopic armies to live alongside you. When you swallow from Pharaoh's cup, your body takes on all of these risks in silence. The dyes, the metals, the cosmetics, the residues, the parasites. None of them dramatic like poison, but all of them cumulative, eroding health slowly. Mummies today tell the same story. They carry traces of lead from cosmetics, copper from vessels, and wear on teeth from sand in bread. Pharaohs looked eternal in stone, but in flesh they decayed under the same invisible burdens you endure at every meal. You cannot escape it. Every banquet is framed in linen, every cup gleams with dangerous beauty, every dish carries more than food. You're consuming not just what is on the table, but everything that touches it. Your role as taster has expanded far beyond poison. You're the unwitting guardian of a toxic fashion show, your body the final judge of whether divine elegance is survivable. The light of the palace shimmers, the walls painted with eternal scenes of abundance, yet you feel your own body heavy with lead, copper, grit, and smoke. To serve Pharaoh is to swallow not only food, but civilization itself, each banquet a cocktail of brilliance and hazard. You're no longer just testing for poison. You're slowly being embalmed alive by the very luxuries meant to display immortality. And if the tableware and clothing carried hidden poisons, the entertainment that accompanied Pharaoh's meals introduced another layer of danger, because the music, dancing, and feasting were more than spectacle. They were rituals of excess where indulgence itself became another kind of weapon against the body. The food on the table is only part of Pharaoh's banquet. What surrounds it is a spectacle so overwhelming it borders on madness. The hall fills with sound, the air vibrating with harps, flutes, lutes and drums played in unison until the rhythm pounds through your chest like another heartbeat. Musicians sit cross-legged on mats, their fingers blistered from hours of plucking strings, and singers chant hymns that echo off painted walls. It is not background music. It is relentless, as if the palace itself must be reminded every second that Pharaoh is alive, eating and invincible. Music was central to Egyptian banquets, not only for entertainment but for religious and magical reasons. Harps were believed to soothe the soul, while sistrums, those rattling metal instruments shaped like loops, were used to summon the goddess Hathor. Every clink and rattle carried meaning. Archaeologists have found murals of banquets where lines of musicians play until their arms droop, proof that this was no casual pastime but an orchestrated display of divine favour. You sit in the middle of it, food still grinding in your stomach, while the sound hammers your ears long into the night. The dancers follow, their bodies shimmering with oil under the lamplight. They move in groups, bending and twisting, balancing in ways designed to dazzle guests and prove the prosperity of Pharaoh's court. Tomb paintings show women in transparent linen dresses, hair adorned with lotus flowers, entertaining rows of reclining nobles. The beauty is undeniable, but the reality was more punishing. Hours of dancing in the heat left bodies slick with sweat, the air thick with the smell of exhaustion. You sit close enough to taste it in the air, another flavour added to your endless role as witness. Entertainment was not limited to music and dance. Drinking contests often unfolded, with nobles urged to consume more wine than they could bear. Ancient inscriptions describe people staggering, vomiting, and collapsing mid-feast, their weakness mocked even as servants rushed to clean the floor. Pharaoh remained untouched, distant, while you sat silently, tasting wine that had already soured before anyone else dared lift a cup. For the Egyptians, this excess was a display of abundance. For you, it was a reminder that survival was not about strength or power, but about managing to keep your stomach from betraying you. The banquets also included games, small distractions played on carved boards with pieces of ivory and stone. Senet was the most famous, a game where moving pieces symbolized the soul's journey through the afterlife. To the Egyptians, it was not just a pastime but a spiritual rehearsal. Archaeologists have found Senet boards buried with kings, carved from ivory, ebony and faience, proof that even play carried eternal significance. At banquets, nobles leaned over these boards, pretending strategy mattered, while you knew that the real game was survival, and the losing piece was always your body. Servants swarmed constantly. They poured wine, replaced platters, wiped spills, and fanned the air with palm branches. They carried trays of flowers to perfume the hall, sometimes stuffing garlands into guests' wigs until their heads sagged under the weight. The heat built as lamps smoked, dancers twirled, and food kept arriving. You sat pinned in the middle, unable to move, trapped in a performance designed to impress gods and mortals alike. The entire spectacle was both dazzling and suffocating, like being buried alive in abundance. The absurdity of it all becomes clear when you remember that most Egyptians lived on bread, onions, garlic, and beer. The farmers who built the wealth of the Nile ate monotonous meals that filled bellies without delight. Banquets like this were displays of power, proof that Pharaoh could command the finest musicians, the richest foods, the strongest wines, yet abundance was poison in its own way. Nobles who attended these feasts carried the evidence in their bones. Mummies of the elite reveal obesity, heart disease and hardened arteries, signs that constant indulgence shortened lives even without a drop of poison. There is humour in the imbalance. The farmers outside the palace dreamed of bread without grit, while Pharaoh's nobles gorged on rotting goose and stale beer. You sit caught between them, forced to taste luxury that tastes less like paradise and more like punishment. The banquet is a performance, but the cost is written in your stomach. Archaeologists marvel at the artistry of painted banquet scenes, their delicate colours still shining after 3,000 years. What those scenes do not show is the smell, the sweat, the insects, the nausea, and the exhaustion. You know them intimately. You live them each night. The music pounds on, the dancers whirl, and the hall glows with gold and firelight. Your role never ends. You're a shadow within the spectacle, a body absorbing every risk so Pharaoh can recline in safety. The banquet is excess raised to religion, indulgence transformed into immortality. But for you, it is one more endless night of noise, smoke, and food that eats you from the inside out. And when the last harp string snaps and the dancers collapse from exhaustion, the real weight of the banquet begins, because Pharaoh's body must be carried from the hall, and you must be ready to taste the breakfast that awaits him with the same risk as the night before. The hall is silent now, the echoes of music and dancing faded, and yet before your body can rest, the next ritual begins. Pharaoh does not wait long before demanding his morning meal. To an outsider, breakfast sounds like the simplest part of the day, a quiet moment after the chaos of feasts. To you, it is just another trial. The dishes may look plain compared to roasted geese and honey cakes, but they are packed with the same hazards, hidden in the very foods Egyptians relied on most. Bread is always the first. Thick loaves baked from emmer wheat or barley, still steaming from clay ovens, their crusts hard and their insides dense. They fill the stomach, but they do so at a price. The flour is ground on sandstone querns, which means that each bite carries a grit so fine it scours the teeth. Archaeologists examining skulls from every class of Egyptian society have found jaws worn flat, teeth broken, and abscesses rampant by middle age. The humble loaf was both life and torture. You bite into the morning bread, feel the sand grind across your molars, and know that another layer of enamel has just been sacrificed to survival. Beer follows, thick, cloudy, and heavy like liquid bread. Egyptians drank it at all hours, even in the morning, because water from the Nile could not be trusted. The brewing process killed some of the dangers but left a porridge-like drink filled with floating grains. Workers consumed it daily, children drank weaker versions, and Pharaoh himself sipped it as casually as modern people sip coffee. The irony is that while it offered calories and some protection, it was also bloating, acidic, and often sour. To start the day with beer was to begin with a stomach already twisting. You're forced to sip first, your lips sticky with the sweet residue of dates and barley, your gut filling with the sludge before Pharaoh touches his cup. Onions and garlic appear next, sharp and pungent, served raw or lightly crushed. Egyptians valued them for their supposed protective powers, offering them to gods and burying them in tombs. Garlic bulbs have been found tucked between the wrappings of mummies, proof that they were thought to guard the body even in death. For Pharaoh, they are fuel for vitality. For you, they're another pungent mouthful that lingers long after the meal. The smell clings to your breath, mixes with sweat, and fills the air until the entire palace seems to exhale garlic. It is not dangerous in the same way as poison, but it is a burden you carry constantly, an odour that announces your presence before you even arrive. Fruits at their own risks. Dates, figs, and pomegranates are sweet and abundant, but they spoil quickly in the heat. A bowl of figs may look enticing, but inside one fruit lurks mould or an insect burrow, invisible until you bite and the taste turns sour. Archaeologists studying dried remains of fruit from tombs have found evidence of rot that began before burial. Even offerings for eternity carried the risk of contamination. You chew the morning fruit with suspicion, your tongue searching for the telltale tang of decay. If you survive it, Pharaoh eats with confidence, never realizing how thin the line between sweetness and sickness truly is. Eggs and dairy make occasional appearances, but they too are dangerous in this climate. Milk spoils almost as soon as it leaves the goat or cow, turning sour in the heat. Butter and cheese exist, but only in hardened, salty forms meant to resist decay. Freshness is fleeting, and sourness is common. You swallow the first taste, your throat tightening against the curdled tang, while Pharaoh waits to see if you collapse. Even something as simple as cheese is another gamble, another moment where survival depends on your stomach's tolerance. Breakfast also carries ritual weight. Food is not only nourishment, but an offering. Priests prepare trays of bread, beer, and fruit to present to the gods before Pharaoh eats. The belief is that divine order must be fed daily to keep chaos at bay. For you, this means every morning begins with a rehearsal of eternity, where the same foods are offered, tasted, and consumed in endless repetition. There is no variety, no surprise, only the grinding certainty of bread, beer, onions, and fruit. Your body grows weary from the monotony as much as from the risk. The morning routine extends beyond eating. Pharaoh's table is surrounded by attendants fanning the air, bringing in trays of flowers and pouring more beer. The smell is overwhelming, a mixture of fresh bread, sour drink, pungent garlic, and perfume dripping from oil lamps. It is less a meal than a sensory assault. Archaeological evidence from workers' villages shows that ordinary Egyptians often ate their morning bread dipped in beer or with onions alone. For Pharaoh, the same staples are presented with ritual flourish, yet the risks remain identical. Rich or poor, everyone eats grit, drinks sour beer, and inhales garlic. The only difference is that you must risk it first, and Pharaoh never has to notice. The humour is in the predictability. Each morning the same foods appear, the same risks unfold, the same bites wear down your teeth and bloat your stomach. Archaeologists call it the diet of an advanced civilization, but to you it feels more like a prison menu repeated endlessly until your body fails. You're not living a life of variety. You're repeating the same test each dawn, swallowing monotony and danger dressed in ritual importance. Yet there is no escape. The sun rises, the offerings are laid, the bread grinds your teeth, the beer bloats your belly, and the garlic fills your lungs. Pharaoh reclines, certain that his body is safe, while yours erodes one meal at a time. Breakfast may look plain compared to the feasts, but it is just as treacherous. It gnaws at you slowly, invisibly, with every grain of sand, every sour sip, every spoiled fig. And when the morning meal ends and Pharaoh turns to the duties of rule, the dangers shift again, because the food you test for him is not only consumed but stored, transported and taxed, and the granaries that feed Egypt hide risks just as deadly as the banquets themselves. The bread you swallow each morning does not appear from nowhere. Behind every loaf is a vast network of granaries, tax collectors, and storage pits that make up the backbone of Egypt. Pharaoh's palace may glitter with gold, but grain is the true currency of the Nile. It is gathered, measured, and locked away in mud brick silos that rise like fortresses across the floodplains. And while the murals paint these silos as orderly treasures of abundance, the reality inside them is less divine. Grain spoils, pests swarm, and corruption festers as predictably as mould on bread. Egyptian granaries were monumental in scale. Each harvest, farmers hauled sacks of barley and emmer wheat to government storehouses, paying their taxes in food rather than coin. These silos became the lifeblood of the state, supplying workers, priests, soldiers, and Pharaoh's household. Records carved into stone show careful measurements, officials tallying each delivery with reed pens and ink. Yet archaeologists have also found evidence of tampering, with seals broken, jars half empty, and rats leaving trails of droppings across storeroom floors. Your morning loaf carries not only the flavour of wheat and sand, but also the invisible trace of rodents who lived in the granaries before you. Rodents were constant companions of stored grain. Mice and rats burrowed into silos, leaving behind droppings, urine and fleas. The same fleas that centuries later would help spread plague were already thriving in the Nile Valley, hidden in the cracks of storage walls. To eat bread in Egypt was to accept that part of it might have been flavoured by vermin. Archaeological studies of grain residues show contamination on a scale that would horrify any modern inspector. Yet for the Egyptians, this was simply part of survival. They built cats into their mythology as divine protectors, precisely because granaries needed guardians with claws. Bastet, cat-headed goddess, was not just a symbol of fertility but also a divine exterminator, tasked with keeping Pharaoh's grain edible. Insects added their own garnish. Beetles chewed through sacks, weevils burrowed into kernels, and larvae hatched by the thousands in the dark. Excavated silos reveal husks riddled with tunnels, proof that much of the grain eaten by Egyptians was already half digested by insects. Bread made from such flour carried not only grit from grinding stones, but protein from pests, baked into loaves without ceremony. You chew carefully, feeling the occasional crunch that no amount of sand alone can explain. It is nourishment, but it is also infestation disguised as daily sustenance. Moisture was another enemy. If grain was not dried properly before storage, it sprouted mould. Modern studies of ancient Egyptian bread have revealed traces of ergot, a fungus that can produce hallucinations, convulsions, and even death when consumed in large amounts. Entire communities may have experienced food poisoning without knowing the cause, their convulsions explained as curses from the gods. As food taster, you would be the first to discover this, your body twitching after a mouthful of mouldy bread while Pharaoh sat safely waiting for his share. The organisation of granaries was a point of pride for Egypt. Reliefs depict orderly rows of workers carrying sacks, scribes recording amounts, and overseers watching with staffs in hand. Yet corruption seeped in at every level. Officials could skim from the stores, keeping extra grain for themselves or selling it illegally. Records from the New Kingdom complain of shortages, missing deliveries, and disputes over stolen grain. What Pharaoh ate at his table depended not only on the harvest, but on the honesty of men whose livelihoods encouraged theft. By the time the bread reached you, it was not just food. It was the product of a system where every hand had already taken its portion. Even the architecture carried risks. Silos built of mud brick trapped heat, encouraging pests and rot. Servants who worked inside inhaled dust constantly, their lungs filling with fine particles of mould and husks. Studies of mummies from working-class Egyptians show evidence of lung disease likely caused by years spent in dusty granaries. You, tasting Pharaoh's bread, inhale the same particles each day in smaller doses. Every breath brings you closer to the same slow suffocation. The irony is that Egyptians saw these granaries as symbols of stability. In times of famine, Pharaoh's ability to release grain cemented his divine authority. He was portrayed as the provider of abundance, the shepherd of the Nile's bounty. Yet the very system that projected strength also introduced silent hazards. Food spoiled, pests thrived, diseases spread, and your role as taster ensured you absorbed the worst before Pharaoh did. Cats prowling around the palace are the most honest reminder of the truth. They lounge in the shade, worshipped as protectors, but in reality they are just efficient killers of rats. The Egyptians deified them not only for their elegance, but because without them the granaries would have collapsed into chaos. Your survival each morning depends less on divine order and more on whether a half-starved cat managed to catch the right rat the night before. You swallow another mouthful of sandy bread, knowing it carries the story of entire harvests, floods, pests, and corruption. The granaries feed Egypt, but they also infest it. Pharaoh eats the symbol of stability, while you taste the reality of rot. Archaeologists marvel at the records of careful accounting carved in stone, but your stomach knows the truth. Every loaf is another roll of the dice, baked from grain that has already lived a life of mould, beetles, and theft. The palace doors open to let in morning light, illuminating jars of beer and baskets of bread carried in by servants. To Pharaoh, this is proof of divine abundance. To you, it is another reminder that survival depends on a system always one step away from collapse. You're not just tasting food, you're swallowing the entire economy of Egypt, with all its flaws, pests, and poisons disguised as prosperity. And as you choke down the last gritty bite, you realise that the dangers did not stop at the granary door, because the farmers who grew this food lived in conditions that brought their own hazards, and the sweat of their labour carried into every crumb that reached Pharaoh's plate. The grain you taste at breakfast carries more than sand, mould, or beetles. It carries the sweat of men and women bent under the sun, their backs cracked and their feet sinking into the mud of the Nile's floodplain. Egypt's abundance depended entirely on its farmers, the peasants who sowed, harvested, and hauled the crops that filled Pharaoh's granaries. To outsiders, their work looked like divine order, the miracle of the Nile's flood returning each year with predictable rhythm. To you, the taste of their labour is bitter, a reminder that every bite of bread begins with suffering etched into human bones. The Nile's flood was the heartbeat of Egypt. Each year, waters rose and covered the fields with black silt, renewing the soil. When the waters retreated, farmers rushed to sow wheat, barley, flax, and vegetables before the ground dried out. It sounds idyllic in murals, where cheerful peasants scatter seed while oxen pull wooden ploughs. Archaeological evidence tells a harsher story. Bones of farmers show arthritis in spines, knees and shoulders, proof of endless labour in mud that clung like glue. Their diets left them short and undernourished, their teeth ground down by grit just like yours, their lives cut short by infections and disease. The conditions of their villages left marks too. Houses were built of mud brick with floors of packed earth and roofs that leaked whenever it rained. They lived alongside their animals, goats and cattle crammed into the same space, fleas and flies buzzing constantly. Excavations at workers' villages like Deir el-Medina show trash pits filled with animal bones, broken pottery and human waste. The smell would have been overwhelming, a mix of rot and smoke and manure. When you chew bread in Pharaoh's hall, you carry the traces of that same environment, because the grain passed through those villages before it ever reached a silo. Taxes made their burden heavier. Farmers paid a portion of their harvest to the state, hauling sacks to granaries under the eyes of scribes who recorded every measure. Failure meant punishment, sometimes beatings, sometimes loss of land. Wall paintings show tax collectors with staffs raised while peasants kneel in submission. Your bread is not just food. It is the product of fear, extracted grain by grain from people who had no choice but to hand it over. That fear lingers invisibly in every loaf you bite, baked into the system that feeds Pharaoh. Disease thrived in this environment. Farmers worked barefoot in the flooded fields, exposing themselves to parasites carried in the water. Schistosomiasis, a disease caused by worms that burrow into the skin, was rampant. Studies of mummies reveal calcified worms still lodged in organs thousands of years later. Symptoms included fatigue, anemia, and organ damage. Yet the farmers kept working, their bodies weakening as they fed the state. When you taste Pharaoh's bread, you taste crops watered by fields where parasites crawled freely, their life cycle bound to human suffering. The irony is that while Pharaoh dined on geese and honey cakes, the farmers lived on bread, onions, and beer. Onions and garlic were their medicine, their fuel, their only shield against endless labour. Herodotus later remarked that inscriptions claimed vast sums were spent on feeding workers building the pyramids, primarily onions, garlic and radishes. It sounds impressive until you realise that these were the cheapest, most monotonous foods available, their strong taste masking the monotony of survival. You may gag on the garlic lingering in Pharaoh's meals, but for the farmers it was a daily necessity, the only flavour in a world of exhaustion. Archaeology reveals more. Skeletons of workers show fractures that never healed properly, spines warped by lifting, and teeth rotted from grit. Even elite labourers at Deir el-Medina, who built tombs for pharaohs, suffered from malnutrition and arthritis despite being relatively privileged compared to peasants. The idea of abundance was always a facade. Egypt's wealth was built on backs that broke under its weight, and Pharaoh's table, where you test each bite, is the end of a chain of suffering that began in the mud. You notice it in the grain itself. When you bite into bread, you're not just tasting wheat. You're tasting the floodwaters, the parasites, the sweat, the blood, and the exhaustion of farmers whose lives were spent producing food they rarely ate in abundance. Pharaoh reclines on cushions, confident in his divinity, while his food taster swallows the truth of where that food came from. You're not only testing for poison, you're swallowing human labour disguised as luxury. Cats prowl the granaries, farmers bend their backs in the fields, tax collectors tally numbers on papyrus. The system repeats endlessly, and you live at the end of it, your stomach the final checkpoint before Pharaoh can enjoy the illusion of purity. Every crumb is a reminder that Egypt's glory rested on poverty. The divine abundance was built on scarcity for everyone else. Archaeologists marvel at the precision of hieroglyphs recording harvests, but your body knows what those records really mean. They mean hunger for some and bloated feasts for others. The palace fills again with the smell of bread, onions and beer carried in from the morning supply. You swallow your portion, grit grinding your teeth, sour beer settling in your gut, onions burning your tongue. Behind each flavour lies a chain of misery stretching back to the fields, and you're forced to carry it inside you, a living vessel of Egypt's contradictions. And as the day begins anew and Pharaoh moves on to rituals of state, you realise that the dangers are not only in what is eaten, but in what is offered, because food was never just food in Egypt. It was sacrifice, tribute and bribe, and the politics of who ate and who starved determined survival just as much as poison in a cup. The bread in your mouth is not just bread, it is politics baked into a crust, soft on the inside and sharp with grit on the outside, as deadly in meaning as it is in texture. In Egypt, food was never simply nourishment. It was currency, loyalty, and manipulation. Pharaoh's table was as much a council chamber as a dining hall, and each dish carried unspoken messages sharper than the knives that carved the meat. Banquets doubled as political theatre. Who sat closest to Pharaoh, who received the largest cuts of meat, who was handed a cup first, all of these details revealed shifting hierarchies. To be served goose rather than fish, beef rather than onions, was a sign of favour. Archaeologists studying tomb paintings of feasts note the careful arrangement of nobles, each one positioned in ways that symbolised rank. To the casual eye, it looks like cheerful abundance. To you, sitting with food still heavy in your gut, it is a chessboard where every plate is a calculated move. The food itself was used as leverage. Grain was Egypt's lifeblood, and Pharaoh controlled its distribution. Officials, soldiers and priests were often paid not in coin, but in rations of bread and beer. Documents on papyrus record daily allocations, sometimes specifying exact loaves or jars. To cut someone's ration was to punish them. To increase it was to reward loyalty. You test Pharaoh's food at the top of this pyramid, but below you millions lived or died based on whether their portion of onions or beer was withheld. Food was law, and Pharaoh's stomach was the ultimate judge. Bribes flowed in the form of delicacies. Foreign envoys arrived bearing honey, wine, oils and spices from distant lands. Their gifts piled high to impress Pharaoh. Tablets from Amarna mentioned shipments of wine from Syria, jars of oil from Canaan, and even exotic animals. These goods were not only luxury but political statements. To present spoiled or poor quality offerings was an insult. To deliver abundance was a pledge of loyalty, and each item had to pass your lips before Pharaoh tasted it, meaning your body became the front line in diplomacy. If the envoy's gift killed you, war could follow. If it merely upset your stomach, it could still sour relations between kingdoms. Offerings to the gods followed the same logic. Bread, beer, meat and fruit were piled high in temples, symbolically consumed by deities before being redistributed to priests and officials. The gods, of course, did not eat, but their offerings were quickly devoured by humans who interpreted the act as divine blessing. To deny an offering was to invite cosmic chaos. To accept it meant reinforcing Pharaoh's legitimacy. You tasted these offerings too, for even sacred food could be tainted, and nothing connected to Pharaoh's reign escaped suspicion. The absurdity is how much of this system rested on illusion. Pharaoh was portrayed as the provider of abundance, yet it was the farmers who sweated in the fields. Officials tallied rations as if they flowed directly from Pharaoh's hands, but in truth they were scraped from the backs of peasants. The illusion worked because food was visible, tangible, undeniable. You cannot argue with bread in your hand, even if it is filled with sand and beetle husks. Pharaoh's power tasted real because you could chew it, even if chewing cost you your teeth. Even the smallest gesture carried weight. To share a sip of wine with Pharaoh was to be elevated in rank. To be denied a piece of meat at the banquet was to be humiliated. Archaeological evidence suggests that meat was rare even for elites, making its presence at a feast an unmistakable sign of favour. You tasted every portion before it reached Pharaoh's lips, your survival reassuring everyone that loyalty for now was safe. But you also felt the sting of politics in your throat. Because if the food was poisoned, you were not just dying for Pharaoh. You were dying for a failed alliance or a broken promise. Corruption wrapped itself around the system like vines choking a tree. Officials siphoned off rations. Priests consumed offerings meant for gods. Scribes altered records to favour allies. Complaints carved into ostraca. Fragments of pottery used for notes revealed disputes over missing grain, stolen beer, and unfair taxes. The politics of food extended down to the smallest villages. Your role at Pharaoh's table was simply the most visible end of a chain of theft and favouritism stretching across Egypt. Each bite you took was part of an economy greased by both grain and deceit. There is dark comedy in knowing that survival at court often depended less on military strength or divine favour than on who received the biggest onion ration. Modern minds picture Pharaoh commanding armies and raising monuments, but in reality his control was secured by bread and beer. Hungry workers rebelled, full workers built tombs. It was that simple. You, chewing bread under the watchful gaze of attendants, sit at the centre of this system, your body absorbing the risk so that Pharaoh can project abundance. The palace fills with the clink of cups and the rustle of linen as the morning audience begins. Officials line up to present offerings, trays of food laid before Pharaoh as symbols of loyalty. You take the first taste, your tongue burning with garlic, your stomach bloated with beer, your teeth aching from grit. Pharaoh nods with approval, his authority reaffirmed, yet you know that his power rests less on divine will and more on your battered stomach. Without you, the illusion collapses. The day stretches on, filled with audiences, offerings, and more food. You realise that food in Egypt was never just sustenance. It was politics disguised as nourishment, loyalty measured in loaves, power symbolised by goose legs on golden plates. To taste Pharaoh's meals was to swallow the entire machinery of rule. Every bribe, every offering, every stolen sack of grain. Your body is the silent witness to it all, the final filter, ensuring that politics can proceed uninterrupted. And as the hall empties and the food is cleared, you understand that the dangers are not limited to Pharaoh's allies or priests. Enemies lurk outside Egypt's borders, and their gifts and their poisons reach Pharaoh's table too, meaning your next mouthful may not only decide your survival, but the fate of an entire kingdom. The trays arriving now are different from the daily bread and onions. They shimmer with a novelty that sets them apart, goods carried across deserts and seas, offerings from kings who fear or flatter Pharaoh. These foods are not born of the Nile's floodplain, but of distant vineyards and groves, carried in jars stamped with foreign symbols and sealed with wax. To Pharaoh they are proof of his reach, tokens of a world bent under his shadow. To you, they are another hazard, for foreign luxuries carry risks that native foods do not. You lift a cup of imported wine, inhale the sharp scent of resin and dust, and know that your lips are about to test more than flavour. Egypt craved the exotic. From as early as the Old Kingdom, expeditions were sent to Lebanon to haul cedar wood and amphorae of wine. Oils came from Canaan, spices from the Levant, incense from Punt, a mysterious land likely near modern Somalia. These imports were prized not only for their rarity but for their association with the divine. Incense was offered to gods, oils poured on altars, wine sipped in rituals. Archaeological finds at Amarna and Thebes list inventories of foreign goods, jars labelled with the names of distant lands. Every banquet that featured them was political theatre, proof that Pharaoh commanded more than just Egypt. Yet trade was a dangerous lifeline. Wine spoiled easily in the heat, turning sour before it reached Egypt. Merchants often masked this with resins, adding flavours that sometimes made the drink medicinal and sometimes made it revolting. Residues found in amphorae confirm the presence of herbs, resins, and even pine tar, ingredients meant to preserve but also to disguise decay. Your tongue is the judge, your stomach the battlefield. Pharaoh will not sip until you have survived the first taste, and what you swallow is less vintage luxury and more the chemistry experiment of desperate merchants. Honey from foreign lands was another prize. Sweetness was rare and valuable, and honey travelled in sealed pots as tribute. Yet honey also spoiled, fermenting in the heat, or absorbing moisture that bred bacteria. It was the perfect carrier for poisons because its sweetness masked bitterness. Foreign dignitaries knew this, and gifts of honey demanded caution. To dip bread in honey was not indulgence for you, but a calculated risk, a moment where alliances and stomach acid met. Olive oil was imported too, though it arrived with its own hazards. Stored in clay jars for months, it could go rancid, its smell pungent and sharp, its taste sour and metallic. Egyptians used it for cooking, for anointing, for lamp fuel. Archaeologists have found amphorae still carrying traces of spoiled oil, thickened into waxy residue. To pour it over food was to invite illness, yet Pharaoh's table demanded it as a sign of luxury. You taste first, your throat slick with bitterness, while nobles praise its richness without knowing the difference. Spices and incense carried dangers as well. Cinnamon and myrrh were imported at high cost, but their authenticity was never guaranteed. Merchants often diluted them with cheaper resins, slipping fraud past customs officials. Incense burned in the banquet hall filled your lungs with smoke that irritated eyes and choked breath. It was worship disguised as suffocation. You inhale it alongside every meal, your body absorbing not only food but clouds of foreign resins that cling to your chest long after the feast ends. The irony is that Egyptians glorified these imports as proof of their superiority, yet they often had little idea what they were consuming. Tablets mention shipments of exotic goods so rare that scribes could not even name them properly. Archaeological evidence shows residues in jars that no modern expert can identify, mysterious mixtures of oils and herbs brought as tribute. You are the unlucky test subject for these experiments, your body cataloguing whether foreign loyalty arrives as nourishment or as poison. There is humour in the way politics disguised itself as cuisine. Pharaoh's court boasted of foreign tribute, yet what really arrived was often spoiled, adulterated, or outright dangerous. Wine turned to vinegar, honey fermenting in jars, oil souring under the desert sun. Pharaoh raised his cup in triumph while you grimaced quietly, your stomach waging war against gifts meant to flatter. Archaeologists see these amphorae as symbols of wealth, but your body remembers them as monuments to indigestion. Even the containers carried hazards. Amphorae sealed with lead stoppers slowly leached toxins into their contents. Jars painted with colourful glazes shed minerals into the food stored inside. What was meant to preserve often contaminated. You drink from these vessels before Pharaoh does, your body absorbing not just foreign wine but the residue of the jars themselves. It is not just trade you are tasting, it is the chemistry of clay, resin, and lead disguised as generosity. Foreign gifts also carried symbolic weight. To reject them insulted a kingdom, to accept them risked Pharaoh's life. You, sitting silently at the table, were the unacknowledged solution. If the envoy's gift killed you, it saved Pharaoh, but it also sparked diplomatic disaster. Your death would be recorded not as tragedy, but as treachery, proof that Egypt's enemies had attempted betrayal. Your survival, meanwhile, allowed Pharaoh to sip with confidence, unaware of how much pain his alliances inflicted on you first. The hall grows thick with incense smoke, foreign wines gleam in gold cups, and nobles praise the abundance of Pharaoh's reach. You sit quietly, your tongue coated in resin, your stomach twisting with sour oil, your lungs heavy with smoke. Egypt's glory is on display, but it rests on your survival. Each imported gift is both prestige and peril, and you are the filter that makes the illusion possible. The banquet fades into night, the last jars sealed again for storage, and you know that the dangers do not end here. For if foreign luxuries could harm Pharaoh, so too could his own priests and doctors, who believed that feeding him parts of animals and even human remains could grant divine strength. And as his taster, those grotesque recipes must pass your lips before his. The lamps burn low, The incense coils in the air, and as the last of the foreign wines is cleared away, the physicians arrive. They come not with trays of roasted meat or baskets of figs, but with jars, powders, and scrolls filled with incantations. Pharaoh is not only a man to be fed, he is a god in the making, and his body must be fortified with substances no ordinary stomach should ever meet. That means the next task falls, as always, to you. Before Pharaoh swallows these offerings of divine medicine, your lips must touch them first. Egyptian belief blurred the line between food and magic. To eat was not simply to nourish the body, but to absorb the essence of the universe. Priests and physicians prescribed recipes that sound less like cuisine and more like experiments gone wrong. The Ebers Papyrus, dating to around 1550 BCE, lists remedies for ailments ranging from headaches to fertility, many of them involving ingredients so foul you wonder if the cure was worse than the disease. Lizard blood, crocodile dung, crushed beetles, and ground ox hooves all appear as recommended treatments. They were mixed with honey or beer, because in Egypt everything was more palatable if drowned in sweetness or fermented grain. Animal parts were central to these rituals. The liver of a fish was thought to restore vitality, the gallbladder of a cat used for certain ailments, and ox fat applied internally or externally depending on the problem. Mummified remains of animals confirm the sheer variety Egyptians sacrificed and consumed in magical practices, from baboons to ibises. To Pharaoh, swallowing these parts was to consume divine strength. To you, it was to ingest rock disguised as medicine, each bite threatening to topple you before he ever lifted a cup. Blood played its role too. Certain texts mention the use of animal blood as both offering and ingredient. Mixed with wine or milk, it was thought to carry power, a life force that transferred to the drinker. In practice, blood spoiled quickly in the heat, turning clotted and sour, swarming with bacteria. Archaeologists studying residues in vessels have found traces suggesting such mixtures were real, not symbolic. You raise the cup, taste the metallic tang of coagulated blood beneath the sweetness of honey, and wonder if the gods can even smell the difference between devotion and decay. Excrement had its place in the system as well. Crocodile dung was used in fertility treatments, donkey dung in poultices, and human waste mixed with other ingredients for supposed cures. To modern ears it is revolting, but to Egyptians it was logical. What disgusted the body could repel evil spirits. For you, however, it was one more spoonful of humiliation, swallowed under the gaze of priests who nodded approvingly at your devotion. Archaeological finds of preserved feces confirm their ritual use, hard proof that these recipes were not exaggerations. Not all of it was absurd. Some remedies accidentally brushed against real science. Honey did have antibacterial properties. Garlic and onions carried compounds that fought infections. Willow bark reduced pain, just as aspirin would centuries later. Yet for every stroke of accidental genius, there were 10 recipes that involved scraping mould from bread or grinding minerals into powder and forcing them down a throat. Galena and malachite, both used in cosmetics and medicine, carried lead and copper that poisoned as often as they healed. Pharaoh's eyes might have gleamed with divine coal, but his blood quietly filled with toxins, and your stomach bore the brunt of the first trial. Magic words were just as important as the ingredients. Physicians recited spells over the mixtures, invoking gods to banish sickness. The recitation itself was considered part of the cure. To the Egyptians, sound had power, hieroglyphs had life, and words could shape reality. To you, none of it mattered when the cup reached your lips. Spells did not neutralize poison, and prayers did not ease the cramps that twisted your stomach after each dose. You were not living in myth. You were surviving it one foul taste at a time. Archaeological evidence from mummies tells the story written in flesh. Traces of parasitic worms, clogged arteries, gallstones, and infections are visible even today. Pharaohs and nobles suffered the same ailments as commoners, only they disguised them beneath layers of divine ritual. These magical foods and medicines promised eternal strength, but they delivered the same frailty and decay. You, the food taster, lived in the cruel gap between belief and reality, your body punished by remedies that were supposed to shield Pharaoh from danger. The comedy lies in the contradiction. Egypt produced monumental architecture, advanced mathematics, and a calendar that tracked the stars. Yet in the palace, physicians still handed Pharaoh mixtures of dung, mould, and animal parts, declaring them gifts of the gods. You swallow first, your lips coated in grease and honey, your stomach filling with bile, while Pharaoh reclines serenely, convinced his immortality is secure. Archaeologists marvel at the beauty of hieroglyphs describing these remedies, but your intestines know the truth. Divine medicine was often just creative poisoning with extra steps. The lamps sputter, the incense smoke thickens, and you slump in your place, weighed down by another round of ritual cures. Pharaoh's body gleams with oil, his eyes painted, his cup raised in triumph. You sit hollow, filled with concoctions no stomach was designed to endure, knowing that your suffering will never be recorded on papyrus. History will remember Pharaoh as divine. You remain invisible, the body that made the illusion survivable, and as the priests chant their final spells, you realize that the food and medicine are not even the end of it, because the very animals used for ritual and consumption carried their own threats, and every banquet was haunted by beasts whose presence was both sacred and dangerous. The clatter of silver bowls fades and the scent of roasted bread lingers. But now the true parade begins. Animals fill the pharaoh's table, not just as food, but as vessels of divine meaning. Every goose, every cow, every shimmering fish is a message from the gods. To Pharaoh, eating them is not indulgence but ritual. To you, it is survival. Whatever flesh is carved from these creatures, it first touches your lips. Cattle were the most prized of all offerings. Egyptians considered them wealth on 4 legs, the living symbols of prosperity. The herds kept in temple precincts were fed and groomed better than many humans, yet they were also destined for slaughter. Archaeological finds of butchered cattle bones near pyramid complexes show the massive scale of consumption at royal banquets. The beef was roasted, boiled, and spiced, served in cuts large enough to satisfy a retinue of nobles. But with the meat came the ever-present risk of spoilage. Without refrigeration, beef turned rancid quickly under the Egyptian sun. Your role was to taste first, to see if the fattened flesh hid sickness. Every bite was a gamble between tenderness and putrefaction. The sacred bull added another layer of absurdity. The Apis bull, chosen for specific markings, was worshipped in Memphis as the living manifestation of the god Ptah. When alive, it was paraded, fed delicacies, and treated like royalty. When dead, it was embalmed and given funerary rites grand enough to rival human kings. Yet ordinary bulls were also slaughtered for Pharaoh's table. You might taste a cut of beef one evening, and then be forced to bow before a bull the next morning. The contradictions were endless, but the stomach did not care. Parasites like tapeworms thrived in undercooked meat, and they had no respect for divine symbolism. Geese filled the courtyards and kitchens with their clamour. Egyptians adored them both alive and roasted. Wall paintings from tombs show scenes of goose herding, with handlers grasping the squawking birds by their necks. The fattened goose was considered a delicacy, dripping with grease when placed on a platter before Pharaoh. To you, the problem was not the taste but the hygiene. Geese lived in close quarters, fouling water with droppings, spreading parasites and bacteria. Even today, researchers examining goose bones from Egyptian sites have found signs of disease. Every time you sampled roasted goose, you risked more than indigestion. You risked swallowing a parasite that could gnaw at your insides for years. Fish carried both blessing and danger. The Nile teemed with catfish, perch, and tilapia, all of which found their way into palace kitchens. Tilapia in particular symbolized rebirth and eternal life, appearing in art alongside gods and in amulets worn by the dead. Yet not all fish were edible. Some species were taboo, associated with specific gods, or with myths of dismemberment. The fish that ate the genitals of Osiris, for instance, were avoided in ritual contexts. But Pharaoh did not always abstain, especially when foreign delicacies arrived. Dried fish from distant coasts, salted and packed, could arrive crawling with worms by the time it reached the palace. You chewed first, swallowing the tang of brine and decay, ensuring that when Pharaoh partook, the symbolism remained untainted. Crocodiles lurked at the edges of Egyptian belief. Feared and worshipped, they were associated with the god Sobek, patron of fertility and might. In some regions, crocodiles were kept in temple pools, adorned with jewellery, and fed offerings of bread and meat. Occasionally their flesh too found its way into consumption, particularly in border regions where belief blurred into necessity. To eat crocodile was to ingest Sobek's power. To you, it was to chew leathery muscle threaded with the risk of salmonella. Archaeological evidence from crocodile mummies confirms they were sometimes killed and processed for ritual, their hides tanned, their organs removed. Even if Pharaoh himself never touched the meat, the possibility was always present. Another surprise placed before you in the endless cycle of divine dining. Cats, though not consumed, still hovered at the edge of your duties. They prowled kitchens, temples and storehouses, sacred to the goddess Bastet. To kill a cat, even by accident, was punishable by death. Archaeological digs at Bubastis uncovered cat cemeteries with thousands of mummified felines, proof of their sacred status. Yet their very presence in kitchens meant contamination was constant. Cat fur floated into bowls, paws dipped into milk jugs, carcasses of rodents half chewed were left as offerings. You tasted food not only for poison, but for whatever feline surprise had been stirred into the stew. The absurdity deepened with insects. Locusts, though feared for their ability to devastate crops, were also eaten. Roasted and salted, they provided protein when fields were bare. Bees supplied honey, the only reliable sweetener, but with it came the risk of contamination. Honey sealed and preserved things well, but when mixed with raw meat or blood in ritual recipes, it became a sticky trap for bacteria. Ancient Egyptian jars examined by archaeologists still carry traces of honey that crystallized after millennia, proof of its longevity. Yet longevity did not save your stomach when priests demanded you sip a honeyed potion laced with spoiled herbs. Each animal carried divine weight. Cattle embodied strength, geese abundance, fish renewal, crocodiles fear, cats protection, bees sweetness. Pharaoh consumed them as symbols, and you consumed them as hazards. Archaeology confirms this constant interplay. Bones unearthed in workers' villages at Giza show diets rich in beef and bread, while elite tombs depict banquets overflowing with goose and fish. Crocodile mummies, cat cemeteries, and sacred bull burials all testify to the dual role of animals as food and divine beings. You lived in that contradiction, tasting divinity one parasite at a time. And just as you begin to think you have survived every animal on the menu, the priests wheel in the jars of imported spices and exotic herbs, each one carrying risks stranger than the last, proof that Pharaoh's appetite extended far beyond the Nile, and that about wraps up another round of ancient misery. If you enjoyed watching me suffer vicariously through history, make sure to check out my other videos for even more tales of lice, poison, and poorly thought out survival strategies. Let me know in the comments which bizarre corner of historical suffering you want me to dive into next. Your suggestion might just become the next bedtime nightmare we explore.